If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are some of the most eerie and unexplained mysteries that you have experienced in your life? One day my mother came and picked me up from kindergarten. We lived in a small town called Sentinel, Oklahoma. When we arrived home, my mom opened the side door which went directly into the kitchen. Once we stepped inside, we both froze. There in the kitchen counter was a butcher knife that had been buried into the counter a good inch, with a note under it. When my mom tore the note away and read it, she turned pale and we noped out of the house real quick. To this day, I'm 41, she won't tell me what it said. Decided to just go over to my mother's this morning on my way to work. This is what she said. When I grabbed the note and opened it, it said, "Please fix the window in your kid's room." I couldn't get it to open last night. She said the words were written in smeared red ink and had a frowny face at the end. She also said that the window above the sink had been open and that's how they got in. No one ever figured out who it was or why. Totally explains why I had moved into my dad's house in Oklahoma City just a few days later. She said that was the last weird thing that happened there. She never told me because first, you don't tell a kid that. Ever. Second, she had just forgotten about it. It happened 35 years ago. When I was 15, I lived in a 2-story house. My dog used to sleep with me. One night he was growling so loudly it woke me up. I had my back to my window and opened my eyes to a bright green light against my entire wall, obviously coming from the window. I wanted to turn and look, but I swear my body wouldn't let me turn around. I stood up back to the window, called my dog, picked him up and walked in the hallway. I closed the door and looked at the bottom of the door to see the light blasting from underneath it. I didn't tell my parents. I just slept in the hallway holding my dog that whole night. So this story starts out kind of funny. I'm about 5 or 6 years old, sitting on the toilet lol. My mom is cleaning that day and I hear her start the vacuum downstairs. All of a sudden, the light goes out in the bathroom. I don't think anything of it at first. We've had the power go out before when too many electronics were being used at the same time, so maybe my mom starting the vacuum caused the outage? Plus it's daytime and we have a window in the bathroom so I can still see. All of a sudden I hear a voice coming from the bathtub though, right next to me. It sounded disembodied, kind of angelic, and I can't understand what it's saying. I'm frozen in place with fear and I start screaming for help. That's when my sister comes bursting through the door. She's 10 years older than me and angsty. "What the hell's the matter with you?" The voice disappears. Was I hearing things? Was that the TV maybe? My parents' room was next to the bathroom, so maybe my dad raised the volume on the TV so he could hear it over the vacuum? I took a second to think about all of that before I answered. I thought I heard something. "Well, if you're so scared, why are you in here with the ducking lights off?" Just before leaving and closing the door, my sister flips the light switch back to the on position. The lights come back on. This isn't too terrible but gave me chills when I was a kid. We were having a small family friends party at my house and I was maybe around 12 at the time. The adults are in the kitchen drinking and talking while all of the kids were hanging on the couch just taking a break from playing around. Suddenly, the bathroom door started shaking in front of us, like when you try to open the restroom door and don't realize it is locked. It went on for a couple seconds before there was a couple of final hard shakes before it stopped. At this point, all of the kids are looking at the restroom door just kind of freaked out and we are silent. Velp, because I was the oldest of the kids, I was the one that got up and tried to open the door. Locked. Maybe a guy had too much to drink and got stuck. I grabbed a toothpick, opened the door and slowly swung it open to reveal an empty restroom with the lights off. I felt my blood freeze and I just closed the door and went back to everyone else. I swore it looked like someone was trying to open the door, but that is pretty much the most unexplainable thing I've seen. I used to work in a crisis shelter when I was in my early 20s. We had a small walk-in room with a solid lock on it to store anything that could be misused by the residents, such as medications, cleaning chemicals, kitchen knives, etc. One night the residents had settled in to watch television while I completed some paperwork, and the door to the medication storage room swung open by itself. I thought perhaps it had not caught properly last time I closed it, so I just pulled it shut and thought nothing more of it for the next few minutes. Then it swung open again. I pulled the door shut and this time jiggled the handle several times to make sure it had caught, and got one of the residents to also test it. It was definitely locked solid. A few minutes later, it swung open again. Wanted to nope out of there but was stuck on a 12-hour sleepover shift. After that it never happened again, but the residents spun a huge story about the ghost of someone who OD'd in the medication room, which became part of the shelter folklore. I was in the car with a small child 4 years old. We were on a road never taken in the past, on vacation. It was the little girl of my friend also in the car for context. She obviously didn't know how to read nor any street signalization. Out of the blue, she said, "I feel a lot of suffering and death around here." No prompt to her declaration. A couple of seconds later we were passing in front of an hospital. She made a couple of eerily accurate predictions like that. Not too obvious either, but still. And then she grew older and she stopped. Once we were fishing off the west coast of British Columbia, Canada. We stopped to jig for halibut. The depth sounder said something like 100 feet deep. It was an old school depth sounder, so you can't see a picture, just a red light at the 100 feet mark. So we let our jigs down and they stop at about 40 feet down. We had our rods out opposite sides of the boat, so our jigs would have been 20 feet apart at least. We both jigged a bit and trying to feel the bottom when our jig hit it. Usually you can tell if the bottom is sand or rock. This felt softer than a rock but harder than sand. After a few jigs we couldn't feel it anymore. So we let our jigs go down some more and they both went the other 60 feet down to the bottom. At that point, we noped out of there. What the hell was that under our boat? My dad lived in a very old farmhouse, with his new wife, her 2 children, as well as me and my 2 sisters every second week. This week, me and my youngest sister, around 8 to 10 at the time, were alone upstairs, my dad and his wife sleeping downstairs. Everyone except my youngest sister and me had experienced something paranormal in the house, and often talked about it during dinner. This obviously scares a 10-year-old girl who is already afraid of the dark. So this night, she came into my room and asked if she could sleep next to me. So she got in, and fell asleep right away. Shortly after she'd lay down, I heard a faint clicking noise, similar to the sound when you click a pen, coming from inside the wall, then slowly made its way to the heater right next to my bed. I figured it was the pipes, and thought nothing of it until I heard the clicking noise literally right next to my ear. Still one of the most terrifying things to ever happen. The clicking noise continued in intervals, moving further and further away from my bed, out the hallway, and when it made the way to the end of the hallway, the sound stopped. I did not sleep much that night. My sister didn't hear any of it, and it has probably been some kind of sleep paralysis, but hearing those noises right next to my ear was pretty scary. Having my mother say she was scared of me but not understanding why for the longest time. Then one morning I figured out why and I was terrified as well. But I still can't explain WTF happened, nor can I verify if she was able to see what I saw. I was living with her and my older brother in a 2-bedroom apartment while trying to get through school. They each had a room and I slept out in the dining room and shared the master walk-in closet with my mother. I wasn't fond of the living situation and so made a point to just never be home except to sleep and shower. I didn't interact with her much at all, and when I did, only to ask if she wanted some dinner or if she needed anything from the store. So not being home much, I couldn't for the life of me understand why my mother was so terrified of me. That was until one morning I was in the closet changing clothes to get ready for the day. It was stupid o'clock in the morning. I walked out of the closet and saw a figure standing next to her bed leaning over her. My mother was still asleep. I stood there staring at it, too shocked to move because it looked like me. It had my hair, my face, my body. Chills ran through me. After a bit the shock wore off and I noped at the duck out of there. My mother is doing much better and I live on my own now. No incidents since then and she's no longer scared of me. Still can't explain what I was seeing that morning. This story is both freaky and super inexplicable. When I was a kid, like 12 to 13, I was playing with my friends in their backyard. It was a perfect summer day outside, probably around 80 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. This detail is really important. So we're playing and I'm chasing my friend, but I suddenly stop because I notice something strange. I exhale and I realize that I can see my breath, just as you would on a really cold day. I call my friends over and they thought I was smoking or something because of how thick the vapor was. None of them can see their own breath until they are standing right next to me. It was only happening in that one specific spot. We walked around, but that was only in that one area that it was visible. All of us ended up just going home because we got pretty freaked out. Moved into an older home in NJ when I was much younger with my family. I was maybe 11 or so at the time. We were getting our stuff moved in and situated one day, furniture and such, when I noticed something very strange. Where my parents had set a trash bin behind the door that leads into the garage, I discovered an outline of a similarly sized child against the wall behind the trash bin they had placed. The outline was shaped as though someone had just traced their kid in a resting position against the wall, but menacing facial features were drawn into it. Demonic-looking eyes, with a very narrow smile bearing sharp teeth. Under these features read Nikki, and that was all inside the outline. They must not have noticed it because it only stood a few feet tall in light pencil. It disturbed me and my younger siblings greatly, and when I showed my parents, they laughed and were 100% convinced we were pranking them with this ducked-up looking illustration in our new house. Unfortunately, we weren't. Fast forward 2 years later. My father is doing work upstairs in an attic cubby, moving bins around to make room for more stuff. While doing this, he bumps a wooden 2x4 in the structure of the attic and noticed that it was very loose. He tugs on it and is surprised to see it pulls out easily. Behind the 2x4 was a drawing. A familiar small outline of a child with demonic eyes and sharp teeth. This time it bears a crudely drawn dress. Next to it read Nikki. When I was around 12 to 13, I was biking around the neighborhood with some friends. One of them mentioned a house in the neighborhood that was supposed to be haunted, so of course we went to check it out. When we got there, it definitely looked like no one was living there. The yard was overgrown and the house looked empty. We talked to another neighbor across the street from the house and he confirmed the family had moved out but no one had moved in, and no one was currently there as he had been doing yard work all day in his front yard and hadn't seen anyone. So we go to check it out. We walked around back and saw more signs it was abandoned. The backyard was empty, but you could see where a table had been before, and there was a small waterfall feature with stagnant water in it full of mosquito nymphs. To our surprise, the back door was left unlocked, so we walked into the kitchen. The kitchen too was empty, nothing in the cabinets, no chairs or table, just the island. No one was living there, which was why we freaked out when the crying started. Suddenly we could all hear a woman crying to herself. We froze in terror, but apparently someone made a noise, because suddenly the crying cut off with a sharp inhale and the woman asked, "Who's there?" We noped the duck right out of there. Sprinted out of the backyard, through a few neighbors, and didn't stop till we were out of sight of the house. We were all freaked out, but also intrigued. Being young and dumb, we couldn't just end our adventure there. The stories were true. The house seemed haunted. We had to investigate further. So we went back. That house was completely empty. We walked all through it, and even looked upstairs and in the basement. Besides some water damage in the basement, there was nothing of note. Just an empty house, that had cried an hour ago. I don't know what exactly happened that day, but there was something in that house with us when we first went in. We all experienced the exact same thing. Whatever it was, I hope it found peace. A family member's house was always known to be haunted when I was a kind. Not in a scary or violent way, just in a kinda creepy / something feels weird way. We had a family gathering there when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I was in the kitchen with my mom and the owner of the house. A fluffy cat walked in and I pointed at it and said, "Aw, kitty." I remember my mom had a weird look on her face and asked me, "What kitty?" And I pointed at it again. The owner of the house laughed and said, "Looks like colorful sponge can see Robbie." I don't remember much else except my mom being really quiet for the rest of the gathering, and clinging on to me until we left. Years later, when the owner passed away, I mentioned the cat to my mom, as well as a few other weird things that happened there, and she said she was freaked out because the cat wasn't really there. The owner told her it was an old spirit that protected the house and only myself and the owner could see it. And the owner had asked my mom to keep an eye on me and let her know if my sight ever progressed into adulthood. I don't think it did. The owner of the house was notorious for claiming to be a psychic and a medium, but I never thought much of it until I heard that. I legit remember seeing that cat and continuing to think of it randomly throughout my life. My father's 2 sisters each lost her husband within a year of each other. Their husbands had been friends, so they ended up buying cemetery plots next to each other. So at the second funeral, we're lowering Uncle B into his grave. Suddenly, I hear a sizzle. I look up, and instead of a graveyard, I'm in a backyard, and Uncle B is grilling. Uncle A, who's been dead a year, says to me, "Do you want some lamb?" Before I can answer, I blink again and I'm back in the graveyard. I tell people that's my seeing a ghost story, but I've considered that it was maybe a vision of the other side. When I was about 10 to 12, a neighborhood buddy and I were camping in the woods. In reality, we were a couple acres behind his house in some forest that backed up to a state park, but that was about as close to camping as I was comfortable with. We had one of his family dogs with us, a beautiful and very protective mutt named Abby. She wasn't the type to startle easy. In the middle of the night we started hearing movement in the forest and Abby started growling and sniffing the air, probably a deer we assumed, until we unzipped one of the windows of the tent a bit to look outside and clearly saw a human figure in the moonlight. It seemed to be standing by a tree just watching us. We kinda spooked ourselves and decided to quietly get our shoes on and bolt back to his place and abandon the camp for the night. As soon as we opened the tent, Abby bolted at the figure, who ran off into the night. She eventually made it back by morning. My family jokingly calls me a witch because weird things always happen around me. I sometimes get weird or useless premonitions, like I know the phone is going to ring, or I know something will fall, or something is going to happen. That being said, I've had a series of coincidences that have made people uncomfortable. Like knowing that the fire truck I randomly saw as a child was on its way to my house. No, I didn't start the fire. Or sending an online voodoo curse to someone and then they got into a horrible skiing accident that same weekend. Or getting mad because my, now, ex planned to ditch our anniversary plans to go to a concert, so I made a comment about how I hope the concert gets cancelled. And then it did because the opening band crashed and one of the members died. Or 2 nights ago, I'm laying in bed with my husband and I say Jesus, that light is bright, and suddenly we hear click and the bedroom light turned off. It's a little alarming. And inconvenient. It never happens when I want it to, and I'm terrified whenever I have a nightmare about a family member. My father, when I was a baby, claimed that nearly every night late into the morning he's seen a ghost while we lived in my grandma's giant house. This was during the 80s. We lived there for a year. After months of this, the topic came up in front of my grandma. She asked about what he saw. She couldn't believe the description my dad gave her and thought he was lying. She pulled out a photo album and my dad went through it and found my grandma's sister as a young adult who died young. He knew her name, age she died, where she was born, and a lot of other things he claimed she told him throughout her visit with him. My grandma was blown away and began crying because she never told him about her, and there's no way he could have known about her besides her sister telling my father herself. My grandmother would tell the story all the time when we were older and would visit her. My father said after we moved out he never saw her again. When I was 6, my grandparents took me to this Christian youth revival type event. There were skits about resisting the devil, sing-alongs for Jesus, gymnastic exhibitions for Jesus, guys in karate gear breaking boards for Jesus, things like that. In between the acts, the presenters would give small speeches about how important God is and how the devil's agents were among us, waiting to harm us. One thing stuck with me because it was really grim. He told of how Satanists were kidnapping people and eating them. Police just across the border had found a hell house, and in that house was a witch's cauldron filled with human body parts coming from a young man who had been taken right off the streets. The boy had been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, then made into a stew that the Satanists ate to give them magic powers, the presenter told us kids. This was the summer of 1988. Years later, curious, I looked up the incident. A student named Mark Kilroy had, in fact, been kidnapped, tortured, murdered, and put in a cauldron by a cult leader and his followers in order to give them immunity from the police and other cartels. All the details fit, except that this happened in March of 1989, the year after the youth revival. How did the presenters know about the murder? Were they talking about another murder? Or did I end up in a Christian-themed time slip? I asked my grandmother about it. She said she had no idea what I was talking about and denied ever taking me to a youth revival. All these years I've never been able to explain it. I used to be on a search and rescue patrol. We got a very strange call one night. A loud car crash in the middle of a rural area was reported by a nearby resident, but when emergency workers showed up, the victims were nowhere to be found. So we showed up to the scene, and at the end of a very long dirt road there was a 90-degree turn with an embankment. The car was clearly going at a very high speed, missed the 90-degree turn, hit the embankment, flew through the air, and the front of the car hit the ground so hard it gouged out a pretty sizable hole upon impact. The windshield showed 2 shattered impact zones where the passengers' heads hit, covered in blood and hair. There was more blood in and around the car. The scene was gruesome and didn't look like a survivable crash, especially given the mangled condition of the car. We expected to find bodies nearby. Police dogs, firefighters, and now an entire search and rescue party was not able to locate the victims after several hours. As night set in, it began to get more and more eerie. There was this horrible looking car crash but no bodies to be found. Finally, after about 3 hours of searching, there was a 911 call that came in, a report of a bloody dead body found in the bed of a parked pickup truck in a rural home's driveway a couple miles away. Apparently a family was coming home from a vacation, and when they pulled into their driveway, they noticed the body and immediately called 911. So 2 police units dispatched from the search to respond to the call. We all assumed this would be the end of the story. Well, the police showed up to the house and to everyone's surprise no body to be found. Somehow the body had vanished. There was blood, but no sign of anything else. So a second search radius started from that house. We searched practically the whole night. Were called back the next morning and nobody ever found the bodies. We eventually called the search off. To this day I have no idea what happened. I was about 9 or 10, I think. One night, I woke up cause I was hella thirsty. Went to the kitchen, had my water and came back to my bedroom. Thing is, as soon as I walked in, I felt the hairs ob the back of my neck rise. I was feeling unwelcome in my own goddamn bedroom, so I just ran to my bed and did the "old monsters can't see me if the blanket is over me." I waited like that for a few minutes and suddenly, I shit you not, I felt somebody pushing down on my head. 2 times. I got out of bed as fast as I could, the blanket still over my head cause I was afraid to look. Slept in my sister's bedroom that night. To this day, I still don't know if it was actually real or if I imagined it, but I still get the creeps when thinking about it. Cold weather survival training. 3 days in the mountains with the occasional below zero temps. 12 students, each 0.5 miles apart. We were given a kind of flare gun in case you hit a "oh shit I'm gonna" moment and you were supposed to head to it if you saw one go off. Anyway, I'm in my shelter freezing my ass off and I see a flare go off. My heart sank and I grabbed my gear and rushed there. As I'm getting closer I see 3 more go off at different sites. Now I'm kinda panicking. 1 is bad, 4 is a shit show. I get within 100 feet of the first site and see the other student's shelter. I warn him I'm approaching and walk up to find him fine, fire going and everything. I ask him if he fired a flare or saw the others. He said nothing and shows me his flares, none had been fired. I check him out, looks fine. Still doesn't say anything, which is weird as duck. Thought he might be in shock, so I stayed a while until he points to the door. I take this as my cue and I just say I'm gonna leave if he's all set and he nods. I walk back toward my site and get an eerie feeling. The whole way, hairs are standing up. I start getting back into my shelter and there is someone in there. I tweak a little and think it must be another student until he looks up and just stares, expressionless. It took me a second to realize it was me, like looking in a mirror. I have never had a more terrible, scared, I should not be here feeling in my life. I bolted out of the shelter, tripped and fell. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in my shelter to a cadre member asking if I'm okay and if I'm ready to hike out. Think everything that happened was a dream. I get up and get my stuff together. As we are walking to meet up with the others, he asked me why I didn't respond to the flares last night. Terrifying. I had a cousin who was pretty normal and happy the first 8 years of her life. One day out of the blue she started getting really upset if she was ever outside bare the woods. Day or night it didn't matter. Eventually my aunt got her to tell her why. Apparently whenever she'd be near the woods or open area she'd see a huge black wolf just glaring at her, baring teeth. Eventually she said it started coming in her dreams and telling her it was going to kill her family. These were pretty dark things coming from a young kid's mouth. Then she started saying she'd see kids come open her door at night and stare at her. They'd shut the door and leave her in the pitch black until she'd pass put from fear. She said she saw the wolf's eyes glaring at her from the closet. Now I've stayed at my cousin's house because me and her older brother were always hanging out. In her older brother's room there were tiny child-sized handprints on the ceiling above the bed. We assumed it was from my little cousin jumping on the bed and touching the ceiling, even though she wouldn't possibly be able to get that high. We tried painting over them but they'd show through every time. Super creepy, I never felt safe sleeping there anymore. Eventually my aunt got the church involved with my little cousin because she started saying the wolf was everywhere. At family gatherings, in the woods at my grandparents' house, up north at the cabins for our family vacation. The pastor came to their home and blessed the house to cleanse it of anything evil. Then one day it all just stopped. My cousin's in high school now and still scares the piece out of my adult self retelling these stories with new details I never knew. Crazy experience overall, but I'm glad she's better now and nothing ever followed me home. When I was 8-ish, I had a nightmare that I was abducted by aliens. Woke up from it having completely turned myself around in bed, my feet were on my pillow, and my head at the foot of my bed. My first thought waking up was, they put me back in my bed wrong. I've spent my entire life trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. One time when I was in 7th grade I was on the baseball team. One day we played next to a cemetery. So I'm playing right field and my back is right up against the cemetery wall, because it's like 4 feet above the field. Anyways I hear a voice whisper hey, so I turn around and nobody is there. The whole cemetery is empty. It didn't creep me out until after. Still don't know where that voice came from. When I was in high school my family went to Mexico, and one night I had a dream where we were at my family's Thanksgiving. Tons of extended family including all of my dead relatives were there, and I had all these weird interactions with them. I told my parents what a strange dream it was, but this was before cell phones or internet so no one else knew. When we got home, there was a message on the answering machine from my 70-year-old distant relative saying how weird it was that I had that dream. Freaky experiences as a child in the 80s early 90s-ish. We'll even give you the exact address where it went down: 2012 Avoy in Alberta, Canada. In our TV room there was a closet door set into the wall. The couch was on at one end of the couch and the door out of the room at the other. I had a reoccurring dream that I would be laying on the couch when the closet doorknob would rattle, then open a crack. I get up and open it. In the dark something moves. I wake up. One night home alone in real life, I am laying on the couch. The power goes out. I hear the knob on the closet rattle. Lights come back on. Closet door open slightly. I backflip over the couch and nope the F out to the back porch till my folks got home. Another time I was brushing my teeth and hear plain as day my dad say, "Can you come give me a hand with this?" Something like that. I was home alone, no one there. Out to the porch again. The breathing in my room, it was always there at night. Lights off. Lights on, no breathing. Got used to that one as a kid. Gave it a name and would say good night to it, I think as a coping mechanism to not be scared. It was a cool old house, lots of fun playing hide and seek, as lots of books and crannies. Also was an old sealed off set of stairs out of the basement that used to go to a storm door like you see in a tornado movie. We covered over the door on the outside with a deck and my dad sealed the basement door. We would hear noises in there from time to time. That's all I can think of right now. My grandfather passed just before I was born. My middle name is actually the female version of his name, and even though I never met him, whenever I was scared, I'm 24 and I still do this, I would pretend he was there watching over me and protecting me. I suffer from sleep paralysis and night terrors and have my whole life, and whilst they're more manageable now, as a kid they were so terrifying that I actually have false memories from things seeming so real that I stopped being able to tell them apart. Anyway, I will mention I do not like the thought of ghosts being real at all, as obviously if they were I would be a lot more freaked out about some of the night terrors among other things that are harder to explain away. However, I did find out recently through both my mother and grandmother that as a child I would say I had two granddads, one that lived on earth and one in the sky. I would also sit in my room alone and have full-on conversations with him, and speak about him in everyday conversation. I personally do not remember doing this, but I do still feel a sense of calm and safety when I think of him, and if ghosts are real, I'm pretty sure he's keeping me safe. Maybe not a mystery, well sorta Ike. But like 3-ish years ago me and my friend were at my farm and we heard a really weird call for help. It sounded a little bit raspy, but it was fairly loud and still sounded human for the most part. My friend thought it sounded like his little stepbrother, so he went off to find him. I was weirded out, so I got my dad and he drove near the woods and started calling the boy's name. I never quite followed either of them. I honestly don't remember why. Anyway, about a minute later, my friend called me over. He told me it's George. George was my chicken, lol. We had chickens at my farm. He had one, I had one, and my sister had one. Mine was named George, or Georges because she was a girl. Well, I came over and he wasn't lying. When George opened her mouth I heard the same raspy sound that sounded like help, and I don't mean sort of, I could make out every sound of every letter. I still don't know why George was constantly making the same noise, or why it ended up sounding like help, but I've never actually tried finding out. And in case it matters, when making the sound it was he help, with the E sound lasting the longest and being louder than any of the other letters and the P being the quietest. This happened about 13 to 14 years ago. I was a junior at a high school on a mountain. My friend and I attended an astronomy meeting at the school's observatory one night. As everyone was leaving at around midnight, we stood in the parking lot and stared off at the nearest peak as we talked. All of a sudden this bright reddish-orange ball of light comes zipping towards us from the other side of it, way up high in the sky. We thought it was a shooting star at first, until it quickly dropped altitude. It was headed straight down towards the tree line. We thought it was going to crash before it just stopped midair. My friend and I went completely silent as we watched this thing hover there for about 20 seconds, when it rapidly dropped below the trees. We could see its glow light up the distant forest as it darted around the trees at an impossibly fast speed for another 20 or so seconds. It eventually shot back up into the air, hovered again for a short time, and then it was gone. And I mean that it looked like someone had just flicked off a switch. It completely disappeared. We both sat in shock for a little bit before freaking out. I still have no idea what we saw that night. It was a perfectly cloudless night, so it wasn't ball lightning. If I'd seen it recently I would have assumed it was a drone, but this was a long time before those were prevalent. And even then, I don't think a drone can move like that, especially not through the trees. About 5 years ago now I worked as a sous chef at a local Greek restaurant. On Sundays we would be closed for lunch, as it was really slow, and we would use the time to do inventory and experiment with features for the coming week. The head chef and I did the inventory in the back primarily, then we'd sit outside in the summer and call the distributors and place the orders. We had been sitting outside and the lights in the building all turned on. Weird, we go in to see if the owner or the front of house manager had come in. Nope, just us still. Next thing we know, the door to the staff change room/bathroom slammed. I knock on the door, no answer. Try to open it, it's not locked, but it feels like someone is pushing against it. Finally I open it, no one there. Next thing we know, 5 or 6 chairs, stacked upside down on the tables, fall off, and the espresso machine starts spraying water everywhere. We cleaned up and noped out of there for an hour or so. To this day I still have no clue what happened. When I was a kid, 9 to 11, I used to help my grandmother with her livestock during the summer, and would stay in the mountains by myself for a week. It was pretty cool to be around nature, and living in a cabin alone. One day I went to check on the cattle in the forest. Once I found them I stayed with them for about 3 hours. Once evening started approaching I decided to head back to the cabin. As I was walking back I could sense something or someone was following me. I looked around trying to see through the trees, but nothing was around. I tried to listen carefully to hear if anything was near, but again didn't hear anything. I picked up my pace and I could hear something walking a distance from me. I used my peripherals to my right and I could make out something pale, like a naked person behind a tree. It looked to be a woman, but as I swung the direction the being wasn't there. It sent an utter shock through my body and I started to run home. Once, I got to the cabin I got the sheep back in their corral and hid in the cabin. I was so scared of what I saw. I told my mom and uncle about what I saw when they came to check on me. They had no idea who or what it could have been. They believed me, but were also stumped. My grandmother didn't know as well, and thought maybe it was a neighbor trying to scare me. Well, Grandma, it worked. An old friend of mine used to live in an old house that a couple family members of mine died in. It was old age for both an uncle and an aunt, and more have died on the surrounding properties. This old house though has the worst feeling at night, like the kind of darkness that pushes you to bed early because you lose sense of where the walls are. A couple odd things happened there as well. My friend and I went out on his porch one night to smoke a cigarette, and as I crossed the front door's threshold the cigarette just dematerialized out of my hand. Thinking I dropped it we sort of frantically searched for it, as smokers do for lost cigarettes, plus they had kids and small dogs so I felt obligated to find it. I ran my fingers along every edge of the door frame, I dug my fingers in every vacant space I could find. We never found it. Not paranormal, but I searched my ass off for that thing, so I like to think a distant relative was trying to get me to quit from beyond the grave. A time came my friend and his family moved to be closer with their family, and the house sat empty for a long time because my family couldn't afford to buy it again. Especially when its age is factored in. I was teenager, and naturally I felt exploratory, so I lurked around it one night checking for ways in. A combination of teenage entitlement, and my family's ties to the building, I felt like it wasn't even breaking in. The thing was, one of the sliding glass doors was left unlocked. Inside I was a little angry to see how messy they left it. It honestly looked like toddlers just left random objects scattered across every floor. They even left behind a small couch I wish I took in hindsight. So I made a little sitting area upstairs with the couch and a couple plastic tables the kids used to eat on. I got high up there a few nights and let myself unwind. It was fun to pretend that I had a whole house just to myself. I always made sure to shut the lights out so I wouldn't be caught though. But somebody or something kept turning the lights on between my visits, and I distinctly remember my family was worried about squatters. It wouldn't be impossible, but this is the kind of rural area where a squatter might be a little more feral, a lack of a better word. Homeless have been known to seek out trailers and sheds in this area. I find that idea more scary than a distant relative's ghost, to be honest. When I was 4 or 5 I had a teddy bear. Took it in the car to a relative's house. We were spending the night there. I had the bear in the car, in my seat, in full view the entire ride there. Got out for a second when we arrived to say hello, and when I went back in the car the bear was gone. We got back home 2 days later and found it on the kitchen table. The house was locked the whole time we were gone, and I was the first one in the kitchen when we got back. When I was younger, maybe 11, my mother and her ex-boyfriend started to get into EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, and wanted to see if they could contact spirits. I was always skeptical and still am, but would join them when they did their sessions to listen and be near my mom. The house I had lived in had been a multitude of deference outfits converted to apartments, and the most outstanding one was that it was a woman's reformatory, basically an old prison for females, a long time ago. The apartment we lived in was small, so my youngest brother slept in a crib in the living room, which was directly adjacent to my mother's room where the EVP recordings happened. My mother and her ex never really got anything concrete. Bangs, loudish static, but never anything good. One night my mother asks, "What's in the woods?" And my 3-year-old brother, who was barely forming sentences, from a deep sleep says, "Don't go into the woods," so calm and crisp. I still shiver and wonder what was out there. I rented an old farmhouse for a few months. My ex-girlfriend's dad was baling hay one day and saw an old woman staring at him from the second story in the middle of the afternoon. There were no other occupants in the house at the time. He was a burly tough farmer guy and he was freaked out quite a bit. I was surprised he would admit he was scared out of his mind. Fast forward a little, turns out one of my family relatives had built the house and lived there. They had a mongoloid son or something and had him locked in the shed. He wasn't allowed in the house. My mother and my 3 aunts had visited and stayed the night there for some reason in the 60s when they were little girls. It was just a coincidence when I had told her where I was living at the time. My mother still remembers how awkward it was. My girlfriend at the time had slept upstairs in one of the bedrooms while I was out of town. She claimed to see an old woman in the middle of the night looking out the window opposite the bed at the meadow. She slowly turned around and stared at her. Then she ran out screaming in the middle of the night in January. She refused to stay there anymore and moved out the next day. I slept a bunch of nights there and never saw anything odd, but the farmhouse is still there. My sister lived there briefly afterward. She lasted maybe a month before she said "duck this" and left after hearing odd noises and random cold breezes in the house in July. It's hot in Missouri in July. Weird experience. My friend and I were staying at a hotel just outside of Frankfurt. This hotel used to be an old slaughterhouse, mind you. So our second night there, we're sound asleep and I wake up in the middle of the night seeing that the TV turned on, showing that black and white pixelated screen. Now, the whole time in the hotel we didn't watch any TV and the remote was right next to the TV. I froze for a good minute trying to figure out how this happened. I eventually got up and turned the TV off. Later that night I woke up again hearing this weird moving sound coming from the floor by the entrance of the hotel room. As I'm watching the dark, I even see my friend wake up and look towards the sound as well. We both just kinda forced ourselves back to sleep at that point. My bedroom used to be in the attic of this apartment house we rented, and I used to always feel like I was being watched while I slept. Like an old man was looking over me. I didn't know if he was good or bad. I always had nightmares of being shot in that house too, which is odd for a middle school kid who lived in a decent neighborhood. Mom used to always yell at us for stomping up the stairs. Sometimes, we'd try to convince her it wasn't us, sometimes it was. Then one time we were all away at camp and the neighbors were on vacation. Mom says she heard someone stomping up the stairs. She doesn't remember saying this now, 20 years later, but I do. Probably cause I knew that place was haunted. Nothing odd ever actually came of it, but just remember feeling so scared to sleep sometimes because of this feeling of being watched. We moved around every couple years, and I never felt that way before, not after that house. Someone died in that house. This was 5 years ago. My mom was 80 and had passed away, and my dad had to go into a nursing home shortly after that. About a month later, as executor of their trust, I had to take care of their house. My mom was a lover of all sorts of tchotchkes, too much stuff, so I was going to have an estate sale to get rid of a lot of it. I have 2 sisters, both are kind of messed up from years of drugs and troubled lifestyles. In fact, the one I hadn't even talked to in a few years because she refused to help my mom out when she was sick. She always had money problems too, filing for bankruptcy, always would make comments on what she would get after our parents were gone. I had paperwork done up by an attorney to keep her off the premises until after the trust was executed. She had been on my shit list for years. My one sister found out I was doing the estate sale, and told the even shittier sister. So shitty sister showed up to the house and just walked in and started yelling at me and got in my face. At the time I had been making out pricing stickers for items, so on the kitchen counter was my stickers, pens and a pair of scissors. My iPad was also there, blasting music. When she started yelling at me, my back was to the counter, so I turned around to turn off the iPad music. Because I was pissed off and flustered, my hand searched the sides of the iPad for the volume and couldn't find it. She is yelling even more at me. How dare I not tell her, and you're a loser. I'm trying to stay calm and it's not working. That's when my hand, while searching for the volume, brushed up against the scissors. They felt so good. The blades were cold and sleek. She is getting louder and all I can think about is taking those scissors and jamming them in her neck. It will feel so good and make the noise stop. But as my right hand is grasping the scissors, my left hand, and I didn't feel it, I just watched it, took my right hand off the scissors. I just stood there looking at my hands. She got out of my face and had turned her attention to starting to go through items I had out on tables. I told her I was calling 911 and to GTFO. I went in the other room and called. She left 1 minute before the cops showed up.